So today we'll be looking at the fundamentals of assessing biomechanically the cervical segment. Before you look at this, make sure that you've watched the review video that's in the same week as this one coming to you. Otherwise this will not be that clear. We've looked at the joints in the cervical segment previously. The review simply goes over that again. So between the two of them, you should understand the mechanics of the cervical segment. Without fully understanding it, this won't mean very much. So make sure you look at these in the order you're given them. And we'll be looking at PPIVMs and PAIVMs. Well, let's look at the fundamentals of biomechanical examination. First of all, make sure that you have a biomechanical dysfunction. That comes from your initial examination looking for a diagnosis. So you should not be doing a biomechanical examination if you've got a stenotic problem or a disc problem or any other problem that isn't biomechanical. Not for diagnosis. You may do it for etiology, but certainly not for diagnosis. So make sure of your diagnosis first, as much as you can. And then the biomechanical examination will give you a biomechanical statement that will refine your diagnosis of biomechanical dysfunction, essentially. So you can go into, again, this is generic, there are tests that can come before your initial PPIVM test, but these are screening tests and it's not a generic type of thing, it's particular to each one. So the PPIVM actually is a form of screening test because it's not going to give you the biomechanical statement you need to do an accurate, precise treatment. So essentially the PPIVM is a screening test. What it tests, of course, is the osteo and arthrokinematics together, plus rolls and translations and everything else that goes with the physiological movement. You need this. If the PPIVM is negative, then you've got one or two things happening. Either you're not very good at testing biomechanically and the biomechanical dysfunction is insensitive to your testing, or the biomechanical dysfunction is insensitive to testing, so it can't be picked up with their tests. We have no idea actually how effective the PPIVM is for picking up dysfunctions. I think it's pretty good, but we don't know. It's almost certainly not going to be 100%. So there are going to be errors made here one way or another. But in general, if the PPIVM is negative, send it out for a second opinion. If that one comes back negative as well, then you're just going to accept the fact that your initial diagnosis was off, or the biomechanical dysfunction that does exist is insensitive to your testing and the other person's testing. The PPIVM tests for hypo or hypermobility. It does not test for stability. And you have to infer stability initially by the presence of hypermobility and subluxations. Now the subluxation is a different phase of instability. This is when it is hyperstable, but that's pathological. And it's a transient period usually of the instability of that segment. But yeah, so it tests for its hypo or hypermobility. If you find hypomobility, then you need to test the PAIVM because you want to know if this hypomobility is articular or whether it's osteokinematic. That is, it's being limited by extra-articular problems such as muscle tone. So the PAIVM consists of glides and basically distraction for the spins that you can't test a glide on. You really don't need to use the PAIVM for hypermobility, but hypermobility will show up with the PAIVM. But you can feel the hypermobility with the PPIVM, and that's always articular and muscular. So this is really for testing which type of hypomobility you're dealing with, articular or extra-articular. And then lastly, there's a segmental stability test, which, as its name implies, assesses for segmental stability. This is a non-ligamentous instability. And I've got doubts as to its functional use, really, why you really need to do it. but that's a whole different proposition. Anyway, it's there. You're testing for non-physiological movements in that segment, and if you find them, you have a segmental instability. But I think the tests are so poor, at least in the way we teach them to other people. I don't want to talk about individuals' hands with this, but I think in general these segmental stability tests are so poor at showing what they should show, that if you have a negative test, you can't possibly say that this is not unstable. The other thing, of course, is if you do that segmental stability test during the period that the joint is subluxed, then the stability test is going to be negative because you've got hyperstability. So you not only have to do the segmental stability test well, it has to be done at the appropriate time. So this is just the fundamentals on each one of these tests, what they test, and basically why you're doing them. Okay, so carrying on from what we just spoke about, we're going to apply this to the biomechanical examination of the cervical spine from C2 down through C7. C1 and 2 craniovertebral joints are assessed differently. So we start off with our PPIVM here, and essentially these are screening tests. You can't get an awful lot of specific information out of these other than there's a problematic segment with particular movements. So if we look at, we're going to do for the PPIVMs side bending, translation, inflection and extension. You can do them in neutral as well, but you get less information from them. But we do flexion extension, side bending right and left, and we're feeling for an end feel. So in this case, we're going to concentrate now on side flexion to the right and its concomitant left translation. And we'll carry that through the whole presentation here. Doing side bending to the left and right translation is the reverse, the other joints are affected. So just translate this over to the other side flexion. So this is where we're starting off with the PPIVM. Now we're going to head this way first. We've got some alternatives that can happen when we do these exams. We can get limitation of right side flexion, inflection or extension, or we can get limitation of right side flexion, translation, inflection and extension. So we'll concentrate on flexion first. So we flex the segment, which brings both facet joints superiorly to their maximal flexion range. And then we right side bend it, which left translate it. Now in order to right side bend, the left facet joint has to be able to carry on upwards. That is, it has to flex more. The other joint, the right joint, simply returns to a more rested neutral position, but the left one has to maximally flex for you to get this movement in. So we can say that for the flexion loss, it will have to be the left facet that's doing it. This is if only flexion's affected, usually. So our first hypothesis here will be a flexion hypomobility of the left facet joint. We test that hypothesis using PAIVMs, and in this case we're going to test a superior glide of the left facet. Now if that's positive, that's fine. We've got our diagnosis, we can move on. If on the other end that's negative, then we have to come up with a second hypothesis here, which will be hypomobility of the anchovertebral joint. Now, this can happen if the anchovertebral joint is anomalous or if it's degenerate. Then when I flex, I can actually disengage the anchovertebral joint a little bit, simply because it's more posterior on the vertebra. So if I disengage it, I'll only get it positive in flexion and not necessarily in extension. So we can then check the glides for the anchovertebral joint, which consists of an inferior glide on the right side and a superior glide on the left side, and H3 may then be positive. Coming down, straight down now here, and now we've got right side flexion, left translation, in extension is positive. Our hypothesis now is that extension of the right zygapophyseal joint is present. And the reason we're saying that is when we extend the facet joints come down, and then when I right side bend, the right one has to come down further, so you're maximally extending that right joint. If that turns out to be positive, then great, there's our diagnosis. when we do the PAIVM, that will confirm the diagnosis, which is an inferior glide of the right joint. If the PAIVM is negative, though, we have to still consider the unconvertible joint as being hypo, although it's less likely than when in flexion, because that's when it's going to engage. So the PAIVM of the inferior glide of the right U joint is done, and that will give us a diagnosis. Coming in the other direction here now, we're looking at right side flexion, left translation, limited in both flexion and extension, which suggests that either the right one can't come down, the right U joint can't come down, or the left U joint can't go up. It's unlikely to be the facets, one on one side, one on the other. So our hypothesis is an inferior, we'll pick the right joint because that's usually what it is, but it may be the other side. So we'll check the inferior glide of the right unconvertible joint. And if that's negative, we will then check the superior glide of the left unconvertible joint. But these are interchangeable. Yeah, you can make the first hypothesis, the left joint unable to glide up, and do exactly the same thing. The PAIVM will then prove which one of the two it is. So that's it. Now, your problem lies is when you get a biomechanical diagnosis from your exam and you're coming this way now, negative PPIVMs, and you're wondering what's going on. So either there is no biomechanical dysfunction, you made an incorrect diagnosis of this being a biomechanical dysfunction, or it's insensitive to your testing, either because your test isn't good enough, or there is something about the dysfunction you're feeling that isn't particularly sensitive to the way you're testing. The main one here is hypermobility. They're much more difficult to pick up than hypomobilities, and they can still give you the same sort of episodic nature of biomechanical dysfunction. So your best bet in this case is to send it out for a second opinion. And if you both come back negative, that's about as good as you can do, and you just sort of put your hands up and say, I really don't know what's going on. Okay, so this is, it seems complicated, but it's really not that terribly complicated. Just think your way through it. Alright guys? I'm going to leave this one clean so you can look at it at your leisure. It'll also show up clean on the PDF I'll be sending of this. Give me a bit of music as well.